So far, the war has uprooted more than 12.7 million people in the past 2 months alone, of whom more than 5 million have fled as refugees across the borders, and 7.7 million remain displaced inside the country. Almost 13 million more people are also estimated to be stranded in affected areas or unable to leave due to security risks.
And Jens Lerche, the spokesman for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, said that the UN now needs more than 2.25 billion for relief efforts in Ukraine, more than double the amount the UN had requested in early March. These are consequences of the terrible war in Ukraine that started in February this year. And as horrible as this is, any war is, as inexcusable as it is, it has a history that led to it. One of the reasons of the current conflict is certainly the appropriation of Crimea by Russia 8 years ago in March 2014. Despite its annexation, Crimea was still considered part of Ukraine by most of the countries of the world in a UN resolution in March 2014. I talk about this today, among other things, with our Catholic brother in faith, Gilles Emmanuel Jacquet, who himself had traveled to the Donbas a few years ago. The logic of violence, now here on EWTN TV UN BLOG. I spoke with him 2 weeks ago and would like to continue this today. A good friend and regular guest on our program, Gilles Emmanuel Jacquet. Gilles specializes in history, international relations and geopolitics. His research focuses on armed conflict, terrorism, religious and political radicalism, ethno-linguistic and cultural issues, and the treatment of religious and ethnic minorities. His research areas are Eastern Europe, post-Soviet countries, Central Asia and the Middle East. Welcome back, Gilles.
Good afternoon, Chris.
What brought you to the Donbas region a few years ago?
I had the opportunity to go there for a humanitarian mission with an NGO set with friends. We collected funds and we bought there medications and other kind of items that were useful for displaced persons. So I've traveled in the Luhansk and Donetsk region, and I've been able to see how the situation was there in 2016. The war was not over. All along the demarcation line, you had still fighting going on, and especially artillery shelling. So the situation a few years ago was already bad, even though it was limited to southeastern Ukraine.
Russia had seized Crimea in 2014, and then at the same time demonstrations and later military clashes started between Ukraine and Russia. Then followed the Minsk Protocol 1, a peace plan that was broken, and later Minsk 2, a ceasefire agreement, which was also broken. Now, when you were in the Donbas region in 2014, so 2 years after these clashes started, were you still seeing tensions between Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, in fact, tensions were already there since 2014 when the conflict erupted. And in fact, all along these 8 years of conflict, we saw an accumulation of tensions. The regime of ceasefire has been violated several times by both sides, and it has been reported by the local OSCE mission. Both sides as well failed to implement the Minsk agreements. So we had an accumulation of tension on both sides, especially as well at the beginning of this year when shellings resumed. And the recognition of the, let's say, independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic by Russia was a sort of red line set by Russia. That was in a way a sort of warning that if shellings would continue, then Russia would intervene. And that's maybe what we failed to predict.
The two regions you mentioned, Luhansk and Donetsk, have a lot of towns right on the Russian border. In the border towns live Ukrainians, Greeks, Jews, Armenians, as well as Russians. What is the importance of these border towns?
Well, border cities on both sides of the border in Ukraine and Russia have ties, economic ties, but as well people living on both sides of the border, they have family on the other side of the border. So this conflict as well is dividing and affecting families. And you have as well people in Russia trying to have news from their relatives on the other side of the border. Likewise, when the conflict started in 2014, it literally divided families, groups of friends, colleagues, and couples. So it's a personal tragedy for, I would say, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians. We have to keep in mind that before the war, and even, let's say, in the previous years as well, even though there was war, you had Ukrainians who were going in Russia for working, you had Russians who were going in Ukraine for shopping. So there were ties on both sides of the border. And now, with this war, well, it's a complete disaster.
Living with a war and with the consequences, such as the sanctions, which unfortunately are not unilateral.
The sanctions are impacting both sides. Russia, for example, that is forced now, for example, to ask payment for gas in rubles. Russia that is telling foreign companies on its territory that if they leave, they'll be nationalized. So it's having an impact on the Russian economy, but the Russian economy is trying to adapt and to turn towards Asian markets more clearly. It will be towards China. With regard now to EU countries, they are affected as well, especially as they are highly dependent on Russian energy supplies, especially Germany. With the current crisis, if Germany is deprived of Russian natural gas, especially through its pipeline Nord Stream 2, it will have a huge impact on German citizens. First of all, Germany will have to look for additional gas supplies. The costs will be higher. If it's in winter, well, people will feel colder. And with regard to the industry, it will have an impact because it will raise the cost of production. Likewise, in other EU countries, the sanctions are having effects on companies that were active on Russian markets in different ways. Should it be by selling machines for the industry, or food, for example, or French cheese, or wine. So Western economy is quite impacted, and especially as we realize that in fact EU markets are more impacted than the US economy. It seems that the sanctions adopted by the United States of America are in a way smarter. They are less detrimental to the US economy, while in the European Union, the sanctions adopted are quite detrimental to the economies of EU member states.
Charles, you live in Geneva in Switzerland, a neutral country which so far does not interfere in the Ukraine war, so far does not supply weapons. Do we actually see any impact of the sanctions on Switzerland at all?
Well, visibly we don't see, let's say, spectacular effects of the sanctions in Switzerland. You have to look at some details. For example, Russian energy companies that are in Geneva, we have a lot of them in Geneva, their level of activity has decreased clearly. We see as well some prices going up, but right now it's not extremely spectacular. It's not something that you would obviously notice. However, the price of natural gas and oil is going up, and some products, especially some food products, are not available as they used to be in the past, especially products coming from Russia or from Ukraine. But as a whole, we do not really notice the obvious effects of the sanctions here. It's more if you look at the details.
Pope Francis recently expressed his deep concern about the war in Ukraine, and he posed the question: while witnessing a macabre retreat of humanity, I wonder, along with many concerned people, if peace is really being sought, if there is the will to avoid further military escalation, or if everything is being done verbally to silence the weapons. Francis stressed the need for negotiations.
Vi prego, non ci si arrenda alla logica della violenza, alla perversa spirale delle armi.
I ask you not to give in to the logic of violence, to the perverse spiral of weapons, but to follow the path of dialogue and peace. The Holy Father urged the faithful to pray the Rosary throughout the month of May and to pray for peace. For Pope Francis, the priority is to help the oppressed in the spirit of fraternity. Gilles, you are very active in the Catholic Church in Geneva. According to your information and knowledge, please give us some examples of what the Roman Catholic Church is doing to help in Ukraine.
Since the beginning of the conflict, I'm not just talking about the new phase of the conflict that started at the beginning of 2022, but already since 2014, the Roman Catholic Church has been quite active in providing humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. We have as well Roman Catholic organizations such as the Order of Malta that have been quite active in providing humanitarian assistance, setting assistance points where refugees or internally displaced persons were moving, providing them with shelters, with foods. We have as well Catholic or Catholic Church-related NGOs that are active in Ukraine, but especially as well in neighboring countries such as Poland. In Poland, the Roman Catholic Church is very active in providing shelter, food, and any kind of humanitarian assistance to the more than 2 million Ukrainian refugees we have in Poland. Likewise, the various Orthodox churches as well are active in Ukraine and in neighboring countries in welcoming refugees or providing help in Ukraine itself to the internally displaced persons. So I would say more generally, the Catholics, but the Christians as well, they are active and mobilized to provide relief to Ukrainian refugees or internally displaced persons. But more help is needed, more resources are needed, especially as the conflict may last longer.
Communicators must carefully observe facts, verify their accuracy, critically evaluate the sources of their information, and finally share their findings. The burden of responsibility is all the greater when, as it often is the case, the reporter must not only report the simple facts of a case, but also explain its implications, providing commentary and the elements necessary for a just judgment. This is what Pope Paul VI said on World Communications Day in 1972, but it should still be true today. I would like to suggest to you, our EWTN TV viewers, to research for yourself all that you hear, for example here in interviews with experts, and what you hear every day in the mass media, and not to rely only on what is put in front of us, of you. I think this is especially true in the case of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Thank you very much for watching. God bless.